I said that, you know what, like he's here all day, so he can
Yeah.
put it on. You know, really just taking up the day.
Well, for tonight, I can't really, unless I go.
Thank you. Unless you want to just, it's more close, not working. Now. Hello. No, it's just the most one. Just a couple of issues in administration, not fine. What? We give what you know.
Yeah. I mean, the only thing I can do is do all the stuff here.
Oh, okay.
The only thing I can do is go home and do them. And, you know, email them over. That's, you know,
Hello? Hello? Okay. All right. Okay. If you leave it by, give me 10 minutes or so. I'll come over. All right. Cheers. I'll come back in 10 minutes. All right. Cheers, mate.
So those all seem, like nice apartments. Yeah. That's good. I was wrapping up.
Hello.
Nice to
Yeah, you too.
Yeah.
At least the last 6 minutes. Okay. I won't distract you.
Yeah.
Uh-oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was working.
It's just we are having difficulty with the monitor work.
But that's okay.
That's why how long can I do?
We've been shooting each of them for 30 minutes, and I'll speak about 10 minutes. Discussion.
Would you like to see Five minutes.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah, I know, it was working about 5 minutes ago. What I'll do, bring up the clicker
Yes, that would be great.
on this.
That would be great.
shall I just upload these then? So that's fine, even if things don't come up. We can just... Yeah, do you want me to save
Yeah, it's good.
Are they saved on this? I can take this over.
You want me to take it?
I don't think I
I think it's
4. So Stephen, you're fine to go first, right? You're fine to go first. I'm just going to give a 5-minute overview of the agenda, and then I'll hand over to you. Okay, so we should probably get going in order to stay approximately on time. So this is the entrepreneurship session at Growth Week. I'm Imran Rasool, and that's Greg Fisher. We're co-directors of the Entrepreneurship Research Programme, and we thought that we'd just spend the first 5 or 10 minutes just quickly overviewing the broad agenda that we have under this research group, and just to highlight how the papers that will be presented today fit into that agenda, and also give some directions for future research that we think still needs to be conducted in this field. So essentially what we're thinking of is thinking about the importance of firms in the aggregate growth process. And so sustainable increases in income aren't really going to be possible without corresponding increases in productivity. And so throughout our agenda, we're going to think about what can improve productivity of firms, of labour in particular, and also what are the mechanisms that might allow the optimal assignment of various inputs into their most productive sectors. Now, the difference between this sector and, say, the firms research group is that we're predominantly focused on smaller and medium enterprise firms, and some of the statistics I'll show you a little bit later will relate specifically to those types of firms. And throughout, I think in each of the broad research questions we have, we're trying to have some fairly common and unifying elements of those. And those are thinking about the role of entrepreneurship as creating jobs, fostering innovation, and through its impacts on productivity and understanding the interaction between the assignment of resources to the most productive sectors, how it can generate economic growth. And so our agenda really falls into 3 broad research questions, and you can find out more detail on these on the policy paper that's circulated from the IGC. So the first set of questions is to think about entrepreneurship as a process of transferring into basic forms of entrepreneurship. So one element of our agenda is really thinking about how can you get households to move away from agricultural activities into very basic forms of entrepreneurship. So predominantly moving away from very risky and uncertain forms of income-generating activity towards somewhat less risky and more certain forms of basic entrepreneurship. And now there's a body of evidence thinking about how the transfer of assets and skills to those types of very low-income households may have impacts on their income, on the volatility of their income, as well as their consumption savings behaviour. This is just a figure taken from some earlier work that I've been involved in that just highlights the longer-term impacts of these types of programmes that are supposed to try to help low-income households change their occupations from agriculture towards some form of basic entrepreneurship. And these evaluations tend to highlight a couple of key features that should sort of be the building blocks of future work. One is that the gains from these interventions tend to be quite large. If you look at income gains 4 years after these interventions, they're of the order of magnitude of 30 to 40%, with corresponding increases in sort of labour productivity. But we also see there are hugely heterogeneous impacts of these types of programmes. Some households who are just below the poverty line, for example, tend to benefit a lot, and households who are very far away from the poverty line may not be the optimal recipients of these types of transfer programmes. Given the heterogeneity, there's a lot of open research questions about what are the distributional consequences of these types of programmes as well, and how do households who have been overtaken, for example, react to these types of programmes, as well as sort of the economy or village-wide sort of general equilibrium effects of these programmes. I think some of the work that's going to be discussed in the second and third presentations today from Mushfiq and Chris are really going to talk about the impacts of households getting opportunities in other types of more highly skilled occupations and some of the wider impacts of those. But this agenda starts off from thinking about transformation into basic entrepreneurship, but we'll look at issues related to that a little bit later today. Then there's a second branch of research questions that think about small and medium enterprises. So these are firms with employees, say, between 1 and 20. And really what we're trying to understand there is what are the barriers to the efficient allocation of resources to those firms that prevent them growing to their optimal scale. Some of the figures that I've highlighted here are from a World Bank database, which is the most comparable measure of small and medium enterprises that we tend to have across countries. And we've just highlighted for the IGC countries what these firms in the World Bank data seem to report as being their primary constraints that they face. And a lot of the usual suspects are in there. Finance is very important. Issues related to infrastructure are also important. This is going to be touched upon in the first paper we're going to see when Stephen's going to think about finance and management constraints for small and medium enterprise firms. But there's a lot of heterogeneity in how these constraints are perceived across countries. And in the second figure, we've broken up specifically the constraints that small and medium enterprise firms are highlighting with regards to institutions and perhaps particular types of policy or the actions of the state in the form of taxes, labour regulation, corruption, the role of courts, crimes and the enforceability of contracts. That area is much less researched relative to perhaps thinking about some of these constraints that relate to the inputs that firms use. So we'd really like to encourage sort of movements along both dimensions. And then the third class of question that we have is really trying to understand the choice on the margin of whether firms choose to be formal or informal, and what are the costs and benefits to firms of making those types of transition, and their subsequent impacts obviously onto issues related to state capabilities and other parts of the IGC agenda. And so the final figure that we just wanted to highlight was just the ranking of constraints related to these institutional constraints as given by small firms, and on the vertical axis we have the rank as given by large firms. So for most of these different types of institutional constraints, we see the ranking to be quite highly correlated between what small firms are reporting are the most important institutional constraints and what large firms are reporting. The one big difference is in terms of taxes, and that may have some first-order effects on the differential incentives of small and large firms to move from informality towards formality. And there's a small body of work that tries to understand entrepreneurs' perceptions of those costs and benefits and how those marry up with actual impacts of making that transition. So throughout this agenda, when we're thinking about trying to answer questions about movements into small-scale entrepreneurship and expansions of people who are already in that sector, one key constraint that we're coming up against is the accurate measurement of some key factors that are going to be first order to understand the behaviour of these firms. So there's a lot of work to be done there in terms of perhaps trying to advance methodologically how we might measure some important types of characteristics related to cash flows or outlays of these firms, the nature of business and management practices that they're operating under and how those might be changed by various interventions. So we think the IGC is well placed to bring together a key set of actors that might help push forward those measurement issues as well as some of the research questions that we've highlighted. Okay. I don't want to take any more time away from our speakers, so I'm going to hand over to Stephen, who's going to give the first paper.
Before Stephen talks, I've been asked to remind everybody of two salient facts. One, this event is being recorded, so for posterity, note that it's available, so time your comments appropriately. And also, if you're someone who tweets and finds something that's tweetable, twitterable, here the hashtag GrowthWeek is the preferred hashtag. I'm sure that means.
Okay, great. 25 minutes. So thanks again for welcoming me here. I'm really excited to present this work, which looks at the impact of marketing on the most common type of entrepreneur in the world, the small business owner in emerging markets. Performance matters to themselves and to multinationals, as well as to policymakers. And so what I'd like to share today are results from the first randomized controlled trial of marketing skills relative to finance skills on firm performance. And we're pretty excited about the results. For instance, a 10-week intervention that improves business skills training leads to roughly 80% increase in firm profits. So let me begin just briefly by motivating the area. We can all agree that increasing the sales and profits of entrepreneurs in emerging markets is important to economic growth for multiple reasons. For one, these firms are either our current or future customers, suppliers, and distributors, and therefore they're very important to the business ecosystem in these countries. For instance, if we were to increase the sales of these entrepreneurs and they were able to scale up, we can achieve greater channel efficiencies or capacities. Think, these small firms grow, they can now sell more items and larger items down the same distribution pipe at reduced cost. Likewise, if we're able to help some of these firms increase profits, then they become better off. Yeah, same with their families and their employees' families, right? Perhaps then leading to increases in GDP per capita. So stimulating entrepreneurship in these emerging or developing countries is clearly important for economic growth. But it's not easy. These firms face some unique challenges. They tend to be small, very small, stunted in growth, and they tend to lack prosperity. In fact, there tend to be hundreds of millions of small firms on the left side of the firm size distribution, very few in the middle, and very few on the right side. Right? And the reality is that entrepreneurs in these emerging or developing countries tend not to increase sales and profits. And policymakers, as well as academics, focus on a variety of different solutions, from improving institutions, information, and human capital, to increasing financial capital, managerial capital. And where I'm going to focus today is at the bottom on managerial capital, and specifically business skills training, an intervention that looks at improving those skills. And just a highlight here is that within this domain of research, some of the evidence has been mixed in terms of finding increases in firm employment outcomes or firm sales and profit outcomes. So we need more research that can kind of tease apart and identify some of this with rigorous evidence. In addition, there's been a lot of focus on maybe finance-related interventions, and perhaps we haven't looked as much at marketing interventions. We know from, at least from the business school perspective, that marketing skills and finance skills complement each other, and so we should be looking at both. And it's not just sort of research that's had some uncertainty here. Even the likes of Mohamed Yunus have doubted whether business skills training should matter, possibly questioning that it could just alone be a waste of time. So what I want to do quickly before I describe what I did in the intervention is just give you a quick snapshot of the results. And in all of these results, what I'm doing is comparing a group that was randomly assigned and received marketing training for 10 weeks against a control group that did not receive any training. Or I'm comparing a group that was randomly assigned into a finance intervention and received that training for 10 weeks versus a control group. I have three main findings, and I'm going to unpack them in a sec, but to highlight. The first is that we find significant increases on some of these key economic growth outcomes, such as survival, employment, sales, and profits. Right? But as you can notice, those in the finance group tend to do better in terms of firm survival, whereas those in the marketing group tend to do a little bit better when it comes to scaling up operations. But the bottom line profit of the two groups seems to be the same. And so we ask, maybe the pathway to profits for these firms is different. And so we try to get further into the mechanism. And that's really what a lot of this research, what's important here is not just trying to identify these main effects, but also to dig into some of the mechanism so that for policymakers we can better understand what are the levers we can pull. And here, the two main findings I think we can walk away from are that marketing training, or inducing sort of marketing skills in small entrepreneurial firms, tends to induce more of a growth focus, whereas finance training tends to induce more of an efficiency focus. And we find evidence that's consistent with this through some heterogeneous treatment effects as well, but I'll get into that. So what did we do? To gather this more rigorous evidence, is we ran this randomized controlled trial in South Africa. We sampled a group of representative firms prior to the intervention, measured them multiple times before, outcomes, and a whole bunch of household and individual entrepreneur characteristics, as well as firm outcomes. We then took this group and randomly assigned 1/3 to a finance intervention group, right? And they got financial skills training for 10 weeks. Another group was randomly assigned to receive marketing skills, and another group was the control group, who received training 2 years later when the study. And then we tracked them over time and see if there's differences in performance. And what's important here when we track them over time is to have that control group that can act as a counterfactual for perhaps what would have happened to those in the finance group or the marketing group if they hadn't received it. So here's what, just to highlight, in terms of designing this type of research, there have been quite a few, well, a handful anyways, of prior studies that we've been finding mixed evidence for. And through discussions, actually, with Chris Woodruff is in here, some of the professors at LSE and Dean Carlin, when we ventured on this new study, we really tried to sort of say, how can we improve the signal to noise, or what we would call the power of the design. And again, in order to really gather rigorous evidence, these are some of the things we tried to do in this particular case. One was just, I'll just quickly go over them, it's not too important here, but getting a sample of entrepreneurs that is a little more homogeneous, which meant maybe not focusing on the tiniest subsistence survivalist entrepreneurs, but those that are a little bit bigger and a little more established, who actually could benefit from business skills training. I think that's important whenever we design a policy intervention, is to think about who do we think is the target audience, who do we actually think would benefit from this program. Yeah? That was the first thing we did that maybe is a little different. We then tried to use an intervention that was a little bit stronger, a little bit more specific by focusing just on finance or just on marketing. And to Imran's point earlier about measurement, we also tried to move away from paper-based surveys and using electronic surveys that sort of triangulate and aggregate estimates in a new way that can try to get them to be a little bit more precise. So we can pick up some of these effects if they really are there, instead of making type 1 errors. So here's the context. We run this randomized controlled trial in South Africa. For interest of time, I'm going to go quite quickly through this. But here's the context. We gather 832 firms. There's a mix of industries, as you can see, across sectors. We have a lot of variation or heterogeneity in manufacturers versus resellers versus service providers. So we hope these results generalize, right? Here's an example of a hair salon. Here's an example of a buildings manufacturer, materials manufacturer. And the only thing to highlight here, when we sampled, we really wanted to make sure, as I said, that the firms in our sample to begin with, we think might actually benefit from training. They were a little bit bigger than those subsistence survivalist firms. 1.5 paid employees, 14,000 rand a month in turnover or revenues, 3,800 in profits. Majority were educated. Okay, so just above that subsistence line. We ran a registration session where all the entrepreneurs had to come to register for the program and get their scholarship letter. 832 attended. We measured them before. We then randomized them into the groups. I won't go into too many details here. And then those who were randomized into a treatment group received the treatment over 10 weeks. Okay? Just something to highlight here, that this particular training program by Business Bridge was really focused on just changing 1 or 2 basic business practices a week. Okay, so I think that might be something else that's different here for skills transfer, is maybe not trying to throw everything at them and information overload. So the entrepreneurs would come in, pay their own ticket, travel costs to come, and they'd come at, let's say it was Monday morning, they'd come at 8:30, they'd stay for 4 or 5 hours, and in that time they'd only learn 1 or 2 or 3 key practices or skills in marketing or in finance. And they did this, they took it back to the week, tried to implement it in their business, came back the next week, shared how their experiences of trying to implement these practices or skills, and then they went to the next module. So it's very, the material wasn't basic, but I think the approach was sort of basic and really focused on just trying to change a few business behaviors. Here's an example of what the modules were. I won't go too much detail. We found attendance rates were the same in both groups, and distributions and averages. Knowledge gains were over 50% in both groups, just showing that the intervention is doing what we hope it's doing, so that we can really understand the outcomes. Here, this is one of the graduation ceremonies the Western Cape government ended up funding. Hundreds of entrepreneurs, after the training, I mean, this was really a big deal for them. Hundreds pitched up to the graduation ceremonies. Their families came, they were in their best suits. It really was an inspirational moment for them. So they really were committed to the training and to doing something with it and making a better life for themselves and their communities. With respect to measurement, after the 6 months after this graduation, we measured them at the midline, measured these outcomes again, as well as 12 months after, using electronic data collection tools. Okay, so the results. About halfway through. Are there any questions so far? Yeah.
The skills were applicable in all the different types of activities that they were doing.
I'm not going to say that they were equitable.
Applicable.
Were which?
Applicable. I mean,
applicable.
what are they teaching that applies all across those?
Yeah, I mean, so one, it was designed by some LBS strategy and entrepreneurship professors, and this was the NGO, sort of an Emirates legacy project. We're from South Africa originally. I wanted to get back, so that was, I would say the quality is quite high. A lot of the pedagogy did come from some of the materials they're using. But yeah, I'm going to show you some evidence that those in the marketing group are doing things differently and applying some of these in their business to those in the finance group, and those are linked to outcomes. Just give me about 15 minutes. That's great. Yeah.
Are you going to talk a bit about the survey design itself?
I wasn't actually going to talk about that here, but maybe that would be open for some of the future research discussion that Imran and Greg said we'll chat about after.
I'm just curious what the measure of profits being used is.
Yeah, in this case, it'll be deducted through different measures of sales, reducing or differencing out costs.
It's self-reported.
It is self-reported, but we have both self-report, unbiased research, as well as the sort of measures where we try to calculate it out. They're separate methods.
I guess just the question is these numbers are incredibly large, and there's a concern that basically, because they're so excited, they could be...
Yeah, they could, but then if it really was just some sort of social desirability reporting bias, I'll show you the trends. You should see those in the control group as well. Yeah. And the second thing I should see is...
you gave them some amazing treatment, and they feel bad that they spent all this time.
Right.
That's precisely the point, right? The social desirability bias is going to be interacting with your treatment.
And you think it would be higher in the treatment groups than in the control groups?
Of course, yeah, that's the general answer.
Yeah, that's, I think in general a concern. So, yeah, I'm not going to get into in detail here, but I think
it'd be good to kind of get, maybe not now, but afterwards, just do some spot checks on some of the, even a small test sample, and see if you can actually, because these are easy to do, you can kind of try and verify sales, you can do spot checks, you can do other checks, you can have
because if it's sales increasing going on, you can actually see customer flow going up, someone outside the shop, or you have such huge measures that it's going to be hard to believe these measures given the return. You want to really push them. Yeah. These are also larger firms, I think, than some of the other studies. So. But let me just try to show you some evidence that digs in a little bit further than the main group. So the group means across. We can go there. Second thing is this is pretty hard to, we're doing another, just run a separate randomized control on just the methodology. It's pretty hard to game it and keep all, I couldn't really keep all these numbers in my head. And that, so and we checked that against just unaided recall of profits, which of course Chris did papers on that, as well as to these sort of calculated measures. And we're just doing the best we can and just pick up. Okay, thanks. So on the effects, I've already sort of shared this. We find these main effects. Survival rates go up relative to the control group. 12.7% bump for the finance group. Does a little bit better than in the marketing group. This is the proportion of firms in each group that are still in operation, 12 months after graduation.
Can you say something about the heterogeneity of this? So one of Chang Tse's kind of big complaints about business training programs in general is that maybe it has the exact opposite effect. Is that maybe one of the problems is that people on the left end of the productivity distribution don't need to figure out a way to improve to be in the right tail. They need to go do something else. Right. And so one of the questions of survivability is it really a positive outcome? And so it'd be nice if you could say something about whether or not it was in a sense the right firms who were surviving, the ones who really had more opportunity to grow.
Okay, I'll show you results on, if I just look at the firms that survive, that those outcome measures are even greater than all of the firms together. So
that's part of it. Yeah,
maybe part of it. But yeah, we didn't go back to both sets of firms after. When they failed, we of course went to them, measured them, but we didn't ask these kind of questions.
Mechanically, you'd expect that the firms that failed would have lower outcome measures than the ones who didn't.
Yeah, which is
yes. Because they failed.
But your other point that I think in general we should be open to firm failure, not necessarily being a bad thing. If some firms are growing and some firms are leaving because they're on the left tail and not very productive, and instead they're going and getting jobs in wage labor somewhere else, save money, fewer hours, I think that's also could be a good outcome. But, yeah.
Stephen, now that you've shown us this, now every, the survival differential.
Yeah.
Now every other outcome, I'm wondering how are you going to account for the selection involved in the treatment?
But these are ITP estimates over in both groups, right?
Okay, but can you measure profits for a firm that has not survived?
For a firm that has not survived. If a firm hasn't survived, profits would be 0, and they're included in the sample that way.
Okay, they're
included. Yeah, everyone's included. These are ITT. It includes the entire.
But 0 is not really the right number. These guys are doing something. Yeah.
Once the firm goes to 0,
I know, but there's not really cost in time.
Okay.
But when I think about how well off somebody is, and I put in 0, that's not really the right thing to put in. I could say earnings, and then I could put in their earnings, but then even if people are out of the labor market, I have to think of what's the opportunity cost at the time of being in the labor market. I've got to somehow estimate what that is. So if I've got a survival, if I have a survival, that's going to drive part of this big increase in profits with the survival.
Yeah.
But
okay, but let me try to show you. If I just look at just the firms that are surviving, for which I would have measures that you think are firm sales or revenues, that I see those bumps going in the right way. But I mean, I really only had about 8 minutes. I would love to just whip through and then open up for discussion, of course. And I haven't got to send you the working paper yet, but I of course want the feedback. Okay, so we see these bumps for employment. I think here we see maybe the marketing group creating about a 0.5 job increase. Finance group more likely to reflect their saving. Sales are going up in both groups, a little bit more in marketing. So here, both groups are growing. But what I want to show is, in terms of profits, the key idea here is that while marketers tend to be increasing more in terms of sales and employment, and the finance guys less so, both on average, the firms in both groups tend to be becoming more profitable over time. Okay, and so we want to dig in. Without the evidence of running a randomized control trial in this way, we're not able to dig into the mechanism and understand maybe how are they achieving profits differently. So how? There's some intuition here that marketing is going to help them focus more on expansion and sort of having a growth focus. Those in the finance group maybe focusing more on reducing costs and having more of an efficiency focus. So here's the, and again, these are, to your point, I mean, course measures, this is the best we have, this is what I'm thinking now, okay? If I just look at the within firm percentage change in sales, here are these differences. Okay, so this accounts for those firms that, you know, could be outliers or those really tiny firms. This is the within firm percentage increase in sales. And the left side is all firms in the sample, roughly an 80% bump. Marketing is significant relative to control. If we look at just those firms, Chris, that are surviving, right, roughly 70%, the within firm percentage increase goes up, right? If I look similarly, these are my growth measures. Unemployment, same thing. Within firm, increases in marketing tend to be going up more. If we just look at surviving firms, we see the bump kind of going up even higher. Now, if I try to think of some efficiency type policies or measures, and this is the only evidence I have given the data, costs. You'd expect here that the within firm percentage change in costs for those in the finance group should be going down if that really is what they're focusing on. And we see that, that the finance guys tend to be within firm decreasing costs more relative to control group. And this is a very, again, coarse measure of efficiency, the output over input ratio. But we also, if firms are becoming more efficient, the output over input ratio should be going up. You're doing more with the same amount of inputs. And we see here again that our finance group tends to be becoming a little bit more efficient, or a lot more. And again, these are noisy measures. We're still picking up on these differences. And it goes up for surviving firms. Okay, other kind of evidence. At the midline, we also, when we were out at these business locations, in addition to asking their outcomes, we also asked a series of about 30 different business practices, things that should be related to maybe what they were learning in the material, and then when implementing in their business. We did our best to verify if someone said, yes, I'm doing this business activity. You know, the best you can do is have the enumerators, you know, try to verify. But here's what we see.
How did they do that? Because that's a constant struggle that will come back
Yeah,
to.
I think in the measurement stuff as well. So one thing we would do, if it was some of the financial things, a record keeping, you could push them to show me the record, right? When it had to do with some of the marketing ones, what we were doing, and again, there's still lots of error here, is to ask, well, give me an example then. Can you get more specific into telling me? And then we try to tell the enumerator to write something down on it. So, but again, these are just yes, no, were you doing that? We're just trying to follow best practices that we've seen to date, but I think on the practice, you're right, we're going to have to get better at measuring it. But here's what I find. If I were to look at 5 activities related to sort of marketing research practices, we put them into a composite. As you'd expect, those in marketing, or randomly assigned to the marketing group, have a higher likelihood of doing more of those growth type practices related to market research. In addition, this composite, the individual items, but the composite, if I were to do 3 or more of these market research activities, this is not causal, but there's some correlation between doing these marketing research activities and profits. So we can do the same thing, and now I'm going to, you kind of get the idea, right? Now I'm going to show you a composite for 5 marketing tactics or practices related to, you know, sort of the 4 Ps. We see again, marketers tend to be doing more than those who are randomly assigned to the finance group of control, right? As you'd expect. And again, doing more of these things tends to be correlated with profits. Sales tactics, again, marketing group has a bigger bump relative to control than the finance group, and it's correlated with profits. If I look at some composite measure of all 15 of these marketing-related activities, and say, you know, doing 10 or more, what happens? Marketing group is higher. Correlated with profits, I'm not sure what's up there. And then you can actually do something called mediation analysis and see if the process actually flows through this variable to profits. And we see that, we find that almost 55% of the effect of the treatment on profits, right, of the marketing treatment runs through, you know, this marketing composite, doing marketing practices. So hopefully, there's some evidence, the best that I can do, to show that those randomly assigned to the marketing group were doing some practices related to sort of growing or expanding the business, as you might expect. And I'll have to go through this quickly because I don't have so much time now. We're going to see the flip side, right? If those randomly assigned to the finance group really are doing more activities related to reducing costs and gaining efficiency, we should see the green bars going up across these practices. And that's 2 minutes, and that's what we see. Opposite on activity-related financial tracking, finance guys going up, and it's correlated with profits. Activities related to sort of financial analyzing, we see finance guys go up, and it's correlated with profits. Similarly, financial planning activities, we see the bump again, right? Is everyone kind of understanding the mechanism here? And it's correlated with profits. Even a bigger jump if we look at the composite overall, correlated with profits, and 36% of the variation in profits is from the treatment is going through finance. I don't know if is it 1 minute? Okay, so this is, I was just trying to understand, who might benefit more, consistent with this idea that those who will get marketing training, right, should hopefully benefit more from getting a boost from growth or expansion type focus. And so this idea of exposure, which is the variety of market contexts in which a business owner has had experience. The intuition is this: marketing training, and so inducing a growth focus, may increase profits more when owners have been less exposed to different business contexts ex ante. So we look at measures before the intervention ever started on some of the background factors of these firm owners, and we try to divide them into those who were high and those who were low in terms of being more exposed to different contexts ex ante. Here's an example would be they previously held a salary job in a company with at least 20 different products. Yes, no, right? High, low. We did it across these 5, created a composite. Distributions are really nicely equal across the 3 groups. We divide them into a measure of those with high exposure and those with low exposure. And again, we expect those with low exposure who never have had a lot of experiences with different suppliers, different customers, different products. Those are the ones you'd expect to see get the biggest bump in marketing and growth focus. Overall, this exposure should be a good thing. It is. Who gets the biggest bump? Again, those who are less exposed ex ante, or have low exposure, narrow exposure ex ante, tend to get the biggest bump in marketing. Right? More exposure, broad exposure is still a good thing, of course, as we expect, but who gets the biggest bump going into the training? And I hope this is some new stuff we're working on, consistent with this idea of marketing and a growth focus. And the last thing is who might benefit more from finance training. Maybe those who are more established ex ante. This doesn't mean they're always the largest firm. They're just a little bit more permanent, a little bit more established. They have some sales or some scale, so they can actually reduce costs or become more efficient. And what we see is some composites, high versus low again. Divide them. Being more established on its own is a good thing, but it's really good if you're more established and you get finance training. Does that make sense? Hopefully these all sort of sit together. And these are the implications, but I've taken over my time, so yeah, is that all right? Yeah. Okay, so that's it. Thank you.
So the role of discussant falls to me, but before I actually make a very short set of comments, are there any other questions for Stephen? Running from the hot seat as well.
Yeah, just getting scared.
In terms of loop, is it faster for the marketing kind of activities to see the return, or is it faster for the finance activities? And then it does create some kind of self-fulfilling prophecies that if you do more marketing, you see immediately.
Okay, so
the sales getting better.
Temporal effect.
So
I start seeing the returns. I can become more motivated, and therefore.
Where whilst accounting improvement or finance improvements may take
some more time.
Unfortunately, the bottom line.
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting way to look at it. Unfortunately, we didn't measure the dynamics over time that way because we only did 2 post-survey rounds. But that's an excellent point. I think which maybe Greg will touch on and is doing it in a study in Uganda. Is the importance of measuring these outcomes over many survey rounds rather than just 1 or 2. But that also requires more resources and more commitment from policymakers to better understand. But you're right. We could dig in more. Yeah. Yeah.
So why is it that some of the people in the finance group
when you showed the kind of adoption behaviours,
Yeah.
had adopted some of the marketing practices. Was it that there was kind of crossover in the curriculum? Or
Yeah, well, not crossover in the curriculum, but I mean, that's always, people bring up this critique, and you could say, well, when I teach pricing, how do you teach pricing just from a marketing perspective? How do you teach it just from a finance perspective? Of course, some things are going to spill over. And just being in a classroom, sharing your different experiences in class, there probably is, if I was assigned to the marketing treatment group, there's probably going to be some discussions of costs. I don't know how you get away from that. In the same way, if I'm in the finance group, talking about struggling on how to get finance for my business to grow, I'm going to have to be probably talking about the new product I want to launch. So I don't think you can make them explicitly separate like that, but I'm just showing you patterns that are consistently within. Yeah, you're right.
A direct follow-up on that, and that relates to Asim's earlier question, is that if you have any kind of placebo questions, which really was not taught in marketing, and you can show zero effect there, then that might help with the concern about pleasing the intermediary. It sounds like those questions are not it, but maybe.
Well, there might be more, some of the specific activity questions might lend themselves to that, so.
And placebos that are somewhat closely aligned with the material that's covered. Someone where they have the incentive to please the experimenter, which says, "Well, yeah, of course I use that awesome marketing practice that you taught me, but it's not actually a marketing practice that you taught me."
Right. And it wasn't even told.
Yeah. And by the way, I value it.
Okay, yeah, that's great. And there was, you mentioned that.
You said that they were coming together in groups and discussing this amongst themselves to come up with presumably more tailored solutions to very specific problems that they were individually facing.
Well, I would say it was less about group discussion. Let's say I entered, if it was a 4-hour course, like module, then I would go in, the instructor, like these are tutors or instructors who are from the business community, have a lot of experience. They're trained to become instructors for Business Bridge, which is an NGO, highly scalable model because all of the instructors and tutors are coming from the business community, especially in South Africa where Black economic empowerment pushes a lot of these large multinationals and firms to have a lot of employees donating time, right, giving back to the community. So if I was the instructor, I would teach the first module, like the first unit in the module, right? 30, 45-minute lecture. Then we'd have like sort of related problems that you might go back and work on your own, related to your business. And then we'd come back and try to share some of that. But the sharing wasn't the primary focus. Right? It was sort of at the end, then there'd be a break, then there'd be the instructor would sort of take all of this feedback and say, so what is something you're going to focus on for the next week? That one behavior that we think out of this unit is the thing you need to focus on. And maybe try to generalize it across the class. But it really was about training, skills training, that they would try to adapt to their own business.
So if you did this, let's say, via an online platform where they didn't discuss as much, do you think it would be less effective?
Yeah, I think so. I think you're going to gain from these analogies and abstracting from other people's experiences, of course. And actually, I don't think we can tease that apart in this study. But in a follow-on study in South Africa next year, what we do want to do is tease apart the training effects from potentially sort of networking or sharing effects. And that's a project that's in the pipeline for next year. Yeah. I think I'm over time, but go ahead.
Were the employment effects that you found, were they indicative of a change in the growth path, or were they sort of one-off employment effects? The 60% increase when you start at 1.5 people is still only about 2 people.
Yeah, so, I mean, you're right, it might not seem that big. What I could say about the effects, the joining effects, okay, a 50% increase is a 60% increase in employment. Might not seem that large, but if you were to give any firm a 25% return on some of these indicators, people are going to take it. We are dealing with small firms, so you're right, it doesn't seem like a large chunk. But across, just in terms of, is this just being driven by just some evidence on the within firm returns there? So, okay, I'm not a policymaker in terms of setting an objective function, but let's say a good outcome for these small firms is a 25% increase in sales, 25% increase in employment, or 25% increase in profit. Let's say that was sort of a good outcome. In our sample, or in our study, the results, I didn't show this table. 1 in 4 firms increase on all 3 indicators. 1 in 4. So it's not just a few firms driving these effects. 1 in 4 are getting better, are becoming better off in terms of increasing employees, increasing profits, and increasing sales. Yeah? And 1 in 3 firms are actually increasing on two of those indicators. So, you know, there is heterogeneity in the returns. It's not just coming to the tiniest firms, the biggest firms, but you're right. I mean, in total, maybe I didn't create thousands of jobs here, but at least it's some encouragement. But it's a hope. Yeah.
I'm just curious, is there any evidence of sort of spillovers? I don't know if you know the intensity of treatment geographically, and if you did, because sales potentially could be stealing from nearby firms.
Yeah.
It's a question of what the general equilibrium effects or something like this would be versus.
Yeah, so I think the only thing I could say is, so one, we do have the GPS coordinates. The businesses are not sort of clustered in any particular way. That has to do with how we sample. I throw all of the sort of distance to training centers and these measures in as controls. The effects don't really seem to move around. These spillovers, I think that was something that Greg and Meredith and Dean were doing in Uganda, was trying to measure effects on other firms. So this study doesn't look at that, but I know others are trying to look at that. So it's a big study from what I've read. Yeah.
Assuming that here the training was offered free of charge, I'm just wondering if there are for-profit firms that are offering these types of training and working in this area.
I mean, LO and some other groups. I know that there are for-profit firms trying to offer it, but in this case, the firms, it was for free, but they actually had to pay a commitment fee. We didn't pay them to show up. We didn't pay them to come to registration. We didn't pay for the transportation costs. They had to pay a 300 Rand commitment fee on day one in order to come in. So they really did seem to value the training. It was maybe roughly estimated as a 10,000 Rand cost to Business Bridge to run it, which was, they had private donors to fund all of this. So if you think about 10,000 Rand, and if the average firm is increasing by 2,500 or 3,000 a month in profits, after a few months, they seem to, if it was something they had to pay for, if you can convince them of the value, seems like something they could pay off after a few months. How long those effects persist, I can say nothing about.
But there are no existing for-profit firms.
Not that I know there's a ton of small SME and entrepreneurial type support agencies and groups in South Africa, but I think I've taken a lot of time. So thanks.
Yeah, so I think if we have time for one more question, if folks want it.
And the value for money, I mean, do you have an idea of how much it costs and how much return you had compared with the cost?
Yeah, that's what I was trying to say. I didn't show any cost-benefit slides here, but Business Bridge roughly estimates, because the scale of the project, they estimated the cost to be about 5,000 Rand, but if they said if I went to a new country, I wouldn't be doing 500 entrepreneurs at a time. The cost to put one entrepreneur through a 10-week course for them is about 5,000 Rand, $500 at the time. Right? So if you were to take this, in the study, if they were to go somewhere else, it'd be some 10,000 Rand, right? And the average firm in our group is increasing profits by 2,500 Rand a month, right? It would take a few months, but they should see some return to be able to pay that off and go ahead. But I haven't shown that here. Some different assumptions on what I think those returns would do that. But yeah, it's a very cost-effective model because they're not for profit and the instructors and trainers are not being paid. Thanks. Sorry.
My comment on this, very, very brief, as a chair, I'll keep myself there. So there was a point that was made, in response to a question that Stephen said, look, we're not creating thousands of jobs here. But I think as we think about this and the value of where this fits into the research agenda, I think it's important to recognize that even if we're only creating a very small number of jobs, on average sort of 0.5 additional employees for each of these firms, the number of micro enterprises that are poorly managed on this sort of left-tail distribution is incredibly large throughout the world. And as we talk about measurement throughout this program, we'll say that we don't know exactly what that is. But even these small increases in aggregate numbers, if we really are talking about a 25% increase, add up to quite a lot. And so one of the roles of the IGC is to figure out how to leverage exactly this kind of evidence, to figure out what we can generate that is generalizable out of an experiment that admittedly just took place in one part with one particular program program in South Africa, but to learn something about how that affects business training programs ranging from Burkina Faso to Bihar to Glasgow, frankly. And so I think that there's a lot that we can do here, and the hope here is that we can push this in a way that is generalizable. And I'll say that as I read through Stephen's paper and his slides, I thought it was very clear that as they designed this, that they had looked at throw the compliments to Chris and his co-author David, who wrote a nice kind of summary piece on what we've learned, or maybe more accurate, what we haven't learned from a lot of the business training and entrepreneurship evaluations in developing countries. And I think that this paper does a nice job of taking some steps along a number of the avenues that they really identified for future research. And I think probably most exciting here is the focus on specific mechanisms. As is kind of well known, a lot of the business training programs that we've seen evaluated, whether or not, and admittedly they've had pretty mixed results, have been pretty broad spectrum programs, kind of organizations throwing whatever they can against the wall and kind of seeing what sticks. And to some extent, we don't really know what sticks. And so I think that this study makes a nice contribution in focusing on a couple of specific mechanisms that we can really start thinking about what it takes to actually change business practices and ultimately outcomes. But as Asim noted, and although it is an advance in the study, one of the continuing challenges is actually being able to measure whether or not behavior has actually changed. And I share Asim's and I suspect a number of other folks' concerns about the question of whether or not people really did change their behavior. And I know this is a criticism that my own work, and frankly everybody who's done work in this area, suffers from, but really thinking about how we can measure whether or not people have really changed their business practices and aren't just saying something and that, oh gosh, I remember that someone told me 6 months ago that I was supposed to do something differently, and I'll feel pretty bad if I realize they just spent $1,000 on me and I tell them that I'm not actually doing what they told me I was supposed to do. And that holds not just from the self-reported business practices, but also from self-reported profits. So I think this paper kind of echoes that what hopefully is now a clarion call to figure out better means of objective measurement for some of these business outcomes. So we're not just learning and hearing sort of what we want to hear, but actually being able to demonstrate that these programs actually are having an impact, because the amount of money spent and where it can have an impact is so large. Finally, I think that there's one emerging theme, and I make this final point in a somewhat self-serving way because I myself kind of have done research here and feel strongly about it. But I think that whether or not you talk about business training programs or whether or not you talk about HIV prevention programs in Zambia or Ghana or whatnot, it turns out that giving people specific actionable steps to take, at least in the evidence that we have, seems to be the most likely way that we can actually have some impact here. And I think that it's interesting that they demonstrated that when you actually give people some very clear steps to take, and in fact, kind of a key part of the program is saying, look, what are you going to do in this next week to change things? We have some emerging pattern that seems to suggest there's a correlation between that and the outcomes. And again, at this point, it's just a correlation. We haven't tested whether or not that actually works or not. But certainly the pattern suggests sort of more can be done to push that a bit further. And I think this is a really nice complement to a lot of the research out there and a piece of pushing the agenda forward. So with that, let's switch gears. I'd like to invite Mushfiq Mubarak up to present about the effects of the expansion of government working opportunities on Northern Bangladesh.
So our host gave me an option, asked if I wanted to take questions, and first I thought, Asim and Greg in the audience, no. But then
Chris is there as well.
Chris is a nice guy though.
You do realize now, even the answer questions afterwards, you're going to be pretty efficient.
No, but then I realized that just now that I'm actually really sleepy. I just flew in, and I need to stay awake, so I need your help to keep me awake. I also see that Eric needs to stay awake, but he has a kid, so he has an excuse. Okay, so please, if there's clarifying questions, please interrupt me. So I'm going to talk about garment sector, manufacturing growth in Bangladesh, and the impacts it has had on the lives of girls and women in Bangladesh. Okay? And there's quite a bit of exciting news, exciting findings coming out from Bangladesh over the last 20 years. And I'll show you just a few time series pictures of this. So this dotted line is the drop in fertility for women, and the solid line is the increase in the average age of marriage, which has been going from the 1970s. It was less than 14 years. That's when girls were getting married, and now close to 18. Amartya Sen, John Drez in India, they've written about this and compared Bangladesh favorably to neighboring countries and other richer countries. So, for example, India is about twice as rich. There are states in India that are about 3 times as rich as Bangladesh. But in terms of these types of social outcomes, especially as it relates to women and children, many states in India really lack behind. Okay? And here's another one. This is about gender equity in school enrollment. So Bangladesh, not only girls' enrollment, not only caught up, but now exceeds that of young boys. Okay? And so this happened between the period 1970 and 2000. And Bangladesh actually achieved this Millennium Development Goal for gender equity about 15 years before the Philippines. And there's a lot of other countries in Africa and Asia that are still struggling with this goal. And so there's possibly something to be learned from this experience. And I think something that Amartya Sen and John Drez talking about is the important role that NGOs have played. Khairul Islam is here, who works at a big NGO in Bangladesh, Water Aid Bangladesh. There's other even larger ones like BRAC, Grameen, that probably has also played a really important role in generating a lot of these gains. Okay, and then here's some numbers from actually a paper that Dr. Wahid Mahmood wrote. He's a senior advisor to the Bangladesh Country Program. And this is an exercise he and his co-authors Niyaz Asadullah and others did with looking at explaining cross-country variation in school enrollment at the primary level, secondary level, etc., and controlling for income differences. Okay? And then they put in a Bangladesh dummy, and what you find is for female primary enrollment, female secondary enrollment, the Bangladesh dummy has a huge positive coefficient. It just says that given income level, Bangladesh seems to be doing surprisingly well in terms of girls' school enrollment. Okay? Conditional on income level. Okay, so what are the underlying sources of these gains? Now, the World Bank and the government of Bangladesh has claimed credit on behalf of a program, a large-scale program that they ran called the Girls' School Stipend Program. I'll refer to it as FSP, Female Stipend Program. It's a conditional cash transfer. So it was cash transfer conditional on, and it's a pretty small stipend actually, 60 taka around that time maybe the exchange rate was about 50 to 60 taka to a dollar, to US dollar. And if girls maintain a high enough attendance rate and do well in exams and remain unmarried, she gets some money transfer. Okay? And there was never a proper rigorous evaluation of this program done. However, the World Bank nonetheless has claimed credit. So, for example, with titles like this, stipends cripple girls' access to school. And a quote from this: "There is no systematic evaluation that shows the causal effects of the program, yet nothing else can explain." Okay? And when I say they take credit, they really do appropriate credit. So this is a picture that my co-author Rachel Heath, who used to work at a postdoc at the World Bank, so maybe we shouldn't be complaining so much. We don't pay for it. But this is a poster that was in the MC building, the main World Bank building lobby. Again, claiming credit for this program. So in Bangladesh, 850,000 girls are still in the classroom thanks to stipends to school. Okay. Now, one thing that already should give you some pause is this picture, which shows that the stipend was around here, right? It shows that there was a pre-existing differential trend in enrollment between girls and boys, and there appears to be a continuation of the trend, not that there's a jump happening in 1984. But then if you start drawing the picture from here, it looks nice.
You did a chart, like a structural grade test. You probably get a gradient shift there.
We did. No, you don't. No.
But I'm not sure. Yeah. So that one doesn't look terrible for garments, but the other one didn't look very good for garments.
Garments, right?
Because garments is exponential through the whole time. So in terms of the population, it's not really important until the
absolutely. Point well taken. From the aggregate time series graph, you probably I should not be making sense, right? But even without an aggregate time series graph, they shouldn't be making too many claims either.
And the microfinance movement in Bangladesh, there is no correlation between the number of clients. And so this is a significant difference with the neighboring countries.
Yeah, actually, in terms of over this period, the percentage of women in the population reach, right, it's actually not that big. right? Of course, it is an important event, but to think about whether this might affect aggregate schooling.
Are there more microfinance borrowers than garment workers?
Are there
More
more
microfinance
borrowers than garment workers?
Yes, of course.
Yes.
Yes.
So in terms of the aggregate population reached.
Yeah,
I
sure.
mean, so
Sure.
Yeah,
that's fine. So maybe I should not make too many comments on the basis of this one. But my point is nobody should be making too many comments on the basis of this one graph, right? Including me. So basically that just says that we need a different strategy and better data. And so here's one clue as to what might have been going on. This is the growth in the garment sector over this period between 1980 and 2010. So how would this be linked to education? Right? This might be, rather than a supply side where you're paying girls to go to school, there might be a demand side aspect of the story. Okay? And the demand side aspect would be factory jobs open up, and then parents see that there are now market returns to education. Because factories require at least basic numeracy and literacy. You actually earn more if you are literate. Right? So these are, I'll show you some pictures. This is not like a two-person enterprise. This is an actual factory that's exporting. Right? And once that happens, then it might start making sense for parents to send their girls to school rather than keeping them at home. Right? So that's another possibility for the education side. Okay? So this is this story.
Just a clarification. I assume the line is pretty much not at zero. It's totally flat before.
It's totally flat before. Right? There was a Korean company, and actually there was a nice IGC case study that was not IGC case study, but IGC supported case study that was done that talked about exactly what happened here. So this was the story. Yeah, this was the U.S. quotas, right? So Taiwan, South Korea were hitting the quotas, and then they started moving and doing technology transfer in order to put a made in Bangladesh label on and earn money. Right?
But there is, from your initial, again, not reading too much in the macro data, from your initial graphs, there is a movement from the 70s on.
Yeah.
And that's the creation of the NGOs.
Yeah.
The 70s is where all the NGOs.
Right. So I'm not sure microfinance is the right thing to think about, but BRAC has huge programs in health, has huge programs in education. That's probably, and that's exactly what Amar Dujin talks about. Right. Those are probably the better things to think about, our more direct measures. So, by the way, I'm going to talk a lot about the garment sector, but this is not to say that this is what explains education gains and female education gains in Bangladesh. Extrapolating from our data, we can probably explain about only 15% of the drop in the gender education gap through the garment sector. So I'm only claiming 15%. There's 85% there that you can have. Okay, so let me spend a little bit of time talking about this story because this is a really remarkable one. The garment sector did not exist in 1979 at all. A South Korean firm took a number of Bangladeshis, trained them, right, and they set up the initial couple of factories around Dhaka. And then you can track exactly how the sector grew. So, and this nice case study does that really nicely, where they look at exactly who were the individuals that started the subsequent factories, the third, fourth, fifth one, and they were all linked to the guys who were trained in South Korea. Okay? So this industry really took off from there, exponential growth. The average yearly labor force growth of 17.3% that was sustained for about 30 years. Okay? It did not exist, and now it accounts, actually that number is old. It now accounts for about 85% of our export earnings. Right? This is not counting, so there are two main exports that Bangladesh has. One is apparel, but the other one's human beings, so this is not counting remittances, but this is like manufacturing exports. Okay? Or manufacturing, agriculture, all put together. It now employs about 4 million workers, and most importantly, why is it related to the gender parity in education? It represents a really large labor market innovation for women in particular, right? Because it hires mostly women. So it turns out in knitwear, it's about half where they have to work with very heavy machinery. About half women in all other types of factories other than like knitting heavy sweaters. It's about 75% women. Okay? And this is happening in a country where women have not traditionally worked outside the home. Okay? And so for boys who were already working outside the home, this was not as big a deal, but for girls it was a very significant thing. And why is it linked to education? It's that factory jobs actually reward cognitive skills. So apart from numeracy, literacy that I talked about, you have to follow directions, you have to work in teams, right? And when I talk to factory managers, what they told me about, about their hiring practices, they say that, we want somebody who's a little bit educated, but it's also the case that they don't want girls who are very educated and have and in their words, too much ambition. Okay? Because the one problem that they face is really high rates of turnover. And they don't want somebody to be moving on to do another one.
Well, have you paid a number of the years of schooling? Years of schooling?
Yes, I'll show you effects on educational attainment, school enrollment decisions, marriage, fertility. And then, in fact, for entry into factories, they administer a reading and arithmetic test before girls get jobs. And this is what a factory floor looks like. So you're working either in lines or I'll show you some, or working in teams. And there are directions up there. You do have to be able to follow directions. You have to be able to coordinate with other people. And this is why cognitive skills and education matters a little bit. So I just want to show you a couple of pictures to show you that this is, formal export-oriented employment. This is not.
Are teams separated by gender?
No. Because there's cutting, there's sewing, and it turns out that a lot of the men are the cutters because they use this machine, and whereas women are doing most.
So it's in a factory, they men and women work side by side.
Yeah. Okay, and one final thing I want to tell you is that it's already grown a tremendous amount, and every 5 years there's usually newspaper articles about how this is going to come to a halt because the U.S. quotas are expiring, or China's getting into the business, or something like that. But there is no. I think there's very little risk of any of that happening. So this is some data from a report that McKinsey and Company did about 2 or 3 years ago, and this is prior to the big Rana Plaza disaster, though, which I'll talk about later. But so the McKinsey and Company report went to buyers of large buying houses in Europe and North America and asked them about their plans for apparel sourcing over the next 5 years. Okay? And what you find is that everybody is moving out of China. So it turns out labor costs are increasing fast in China. It's not very competitive anymore, right? And they're going to strongly decrease from China, and the primary location they plan to go to is Bangladesh. Okay? And Vietnam, Indonesia, Cambodia also appear on that list. Okay? Now Bangladesh still has, this is not to say that this is definitely going to happen. Bangladesh has very significant governance challenges, very significant infrastructure challenges, even relative to Vietnam and Indonesia. And so, a lot of things have to be fixed for this to actually be realized, but for now, this still represents the most promising growth potential for the country. Okay, so now thinking about, I'm going to have 2 slides on what otherwise would be theory, linking the presence of garment factories to educational sources, and then in the next slide, garment factories to fertility marriage. So first, this returns the claim I'm making is that factory growth increases the returns to education. We've already talked about this. And parents might respond by keeping their daughters in school. So there's a lot of indication in the data that this is true. Women employed in the ready-made garment sector earn 14% more than women of the same education experience employed elsewhere. There's a lot of selection issues with this. This is just a Mincer weight equation.
What's the time frame for this?
For your data? So we collected data in one particular year in 2010, but we collected lots of retrospective information on their entire employment history then.
But the 13% comes from 2010.
So this is 2010, but we have wage histories annually, right, going back like 8 to 10 years. Okay. And within the garment sector, every extra year of education that a girl has is associated with about 4% increase in wages. And also, why is it that factory access might matter? It's because parents actually really prefer their girls to be living at home and working in factories. So you might have heard of cases where girls move to Dhaka and live in dormitories, right? So that is, culturally less. Well, first of all, it happens less, and that's not the most common form of employment. But also, it's culturally less preferred.
So that's why factory proximity might matter for job access, and that will give us some identification, which is how close are the girls to where the factories are located. And also, beyond the demand for education effect, there might also be income effects here. So if your older sister or your mother has access to a factory job, your family is wealthier, and maybe that's what allowed them to go to school. Right? So we have data on whether the mother ever worked outside the home, whether the older sisters ever worked outside the home. That doesn't seem to be what's going on.
Do we know if the return to the year of schooling is outside of the garment sector? I mean, so this doesn't seem enormously high to me, I guess. And so,
Yeah. I don't know.
Just given these wage premiums, how do you reconcile this wage premium with the fact you mentioned earlier about high levels of turnover that concern individuals who are hiring these firms?
Well, because they're moving between factories. That's the nature of the turnover. That's what you're worried about. That you get trained somewhere. And I'm sure, that's kind of the motivation behind the work that Chris Woodruff and Rocco are doing, where any individual factory is not very willing to train workers and invest in workers because they can move to another factory. And another mechanism that probably goes in the opposite direction is that now if a factory opens up, that creates an incentive for you to maybe not stay in school because you have access to nice wages outside of schooling, and that might induce you to drop out. Right.
The age limit, what is the age limit for people getting into the factory?
So because the buyers are facing a lot of scrutiny, like remember the Nike case in Indonesia, so child labor is not very common. Right? And so in our data, we are observing 17, 18-year-olds working.
So then there shouldn't be a much sort of impact on dropouts?
Earlier age. And that's exactly why we'll differentiate these enrollment sets by age. So what we'll see is that for younger girls, for 5 to 10-year-olds, right, these types of mechanisms should dominate. And maybe 17, 18-year-olds, this mechanism becomes relevant. Okay, and so that's a link to education. It can go in both directions, but it depends on the age distribution. And for marriage and childbirth, you might think that girls or families might be induced to keep their daughters from getting married too young, or having kids too young, for 2 reasons. So one is that when there's extra educational investments in earlier ages, girls are actually staying in school longer, right? And they now have the potential to earn a return from that, right? So that might delay marriage. And the other one directly is if you have access to a factory job, you actually go and work rather than, and your daughter earns money for the home rather than send her off to be fed by our husband's family. And so essentially, in an economics model, the way we would model this is that access to jobs would raise the opportunity cost of getting married and having children.
Just to go back to the earlier question, I'm trying to understand, if I were to decompose the wage premium from these types of jobs, part of it is driven by the fact that these jobs exist, and then part of it is driven by the fact that this is a competitive sector, and a lot of the wage growth comes from this threat to leave the firm. So it's the combination of both sort of the industrial organisation of this sector plus the fact that this sector exists. I'm wondering whether you can exploit that second source of variation.
Yeah, that's a great point. I've never thought about that. So if you have, if there's different densities of employment across locations.
Because that's what we seem to suggest that a lot of the wage growth is coming from, the fact that I can change firms, and that obviously is not good for the employers. That's what they like.
Well, okay.
In terms of the attractiveness of this job, it's really those 2 mechanisms you want to separate.
That's a good idea. So we can look and see if we'll have geographic variation in that.
Did you do also some studies on dowries?
Dowry?
Yeah, dowries. Because is there an impact of
Right.
dowry if the young woman is working?
Yeah. So the problem with the problem with the dowry study is exactly the types of measurement issues that were brought up in the first presentation, which is it's illegal. And so when you ask questions, it's hard to get good answers. Okay, and we're focused on, but the point is well taken. There might be effects there, but that's not what we're looking at. Okay, so the reason why marriage and childbirth are important outcomes to look at is that there's a big literature, I haven't cited all the studies there, that suggests that early marriage and early childbirth is associated with a range of adverse development outcomes for the woman and her children, her status in her husband's household, and what the kind of bargaining power she has, the decisions she gets to make for her children, they're all adversely affected. Okay, and so I'll tell you a little bit about survey data. So the first thing we're going to do is to collect variation in proximity to factors. So we've collected data in 2 districts in Bangladesh, Dhaka and Gazipur. These are all, in this area, relatively close to Dhaka city. But this is where there's a huge hub of garment factories. And we collected data in these districts in 44 villages, which could be characterized as within commuting distance of factories, and 16 villages which are not. And we surveyed households in both sets of villages. So that's going to be one source of variation. Villages within commuting distance versus women living in villages that are slightly further away, but within the same sub-districts.
This is where people are now? This is not where they're born?
So this is...
No, I'm puzzled because the data we have suggests that the workers are coming from...
Are they born around? Yeah. So there's 2 ways that one could collect data on women working in factories. So one is that you go to factories, you figure out the employees, and then you ask them where are they, right? So that's going to give you a mix of people who are commuting daily or people who move here to get access, right? So the way to think about it is rather than going to factories, we're going to households, right? Doing household surveys at 6 locations. So we're going to only get the subset of women working in these factories where they are living at home. And
but then I'm going to get a hugely selected sample, because the people in the non-commuting villages will have moved to someplace else. They're not going to be in the village anymore. If they're going to work in the sector, they will have moved into the sector to work.
Yeah, that's a fair point. If in
hugely selected, but there's some selection in there.
So absolutely. So that's right. So for that reason, as well as other reasons we'll talk about, there is going to be a lot of problems comparing girls in these 44 villages versus in these 16, right? And you just pointed out a good one, right? So that's not the only thing we're going to do. We're going to look at a triple difference, essentially, and we're going to compare basically siblings within the same household. Yeah?
I was thinking the same thing, because in our sample, very rural, about 11% of people move to garment factories. But they're doing it before they get married. So what percentage of people in these factories are local? What percentage of these migrate?
So from our data, we cannot answer that question because we are only fixated on the set of people who are living at home and commuting.
So you say 75%
So,
of girls?
75% of the operators in factories. I don't. That's not. I can look at my gender, but in our sample, 75% are from outside Gazipur, Dhaka.
Okay. And all the factories are in Gazipur.
And all the factories in Gazipur. So a large part.
Okay. So let me show you what the identification is, and then we can think about whether because I'm not going to be ultimately I'm not going to be comparing across locations like this.
Right. I mean, there's nothing wrong with your identification. It's just you're saying what's the effect of factories on girls who live there as opposed to the effect.
Exactly. It's an effect on a selected sample. All right, so the difference is, the triple difference we'll use. So one is by what we just talked about, this village's proximity to garment factories. So this is the 44 versus 16 villages, where there might be many selection issues. So Chris pointed one out. Another one would be that villages that are closer to, you guys are, your clocks aren't synced up. Like I just thought.
We give them extra time.
All right, so another problem would be that villages that are located closer to where the factories are, they may be more urbanized, right? There might be other different things that could be done. And then we also went in and collected data on when all the factories in that area opened, right? So we went in and asked, and actually were careful to account for the fact that many factories are closed. Right? So we went and asked the knowledgeable people in the village, when is the first year that people from the village started commuting to factories that opened there. Yes. So we have a good history of when factories opened and shut, and like whether employment opportunities exist close to each of these villages at different points in time. Yeah.
Did you across girls, just age cohorts? Is that a variation you exploit, or is it deliberate variation there?
Yeah, no, we do actually. So what
when
we
you
have,
say siblings, it's not just across gender; it's within gender.
So for the SSP we do exactly that. So I'll talk about this for the female stipend program because that's that's for girls. But yeah, we have the opportunity to do this over here.
It may be nice, but I guess the concern of all of these things is that ultimately the variation still is location/gender, but there's lots of gender trends within like every movement one could think of in
But we put in gender-specific trends as well. So yeah, these are all good points. So ultimately, this is not an experiment, right? And there's going to be room to quibble about this for sure. Right?
But if you do it within girls, that would be very nice.
Very nice. Okay.
Particularly if you have factory close-ins as well. Right. Okay. Then you actually have a reverse. The time trend is going to be. That would be very nice.
Okay, and then finally, we also look at a comparison by gender. So, and then we sometimes put in household sex defense or not. So that comparison you should think of as one with the triple difference. There's a household at a fixed location in one of these villages, and over time factories have opened up, right? Maybe and so then the question is, are the girls more likely to be put in school compared to her brother? Okay? And then the idea that Asim just gave is you could be looking at older versus younger sisters, where the younger sister is in school at a time when factories arrived, where the older sister wasn't, and you could do that comparison. And actually, that's something we have done, and I know the results.
Actually, you could. I mean, if you think of something like Dave Atkins stuff, there probably is a negative effect on higher. I don't know if there's any higher education in these things, but my assumption is you don't need to have a master's degree.
But you can only exactly, but you can. That's right.
So there's a negative tail which might be happening as well.
I'll show you that in a second.
So Mishmi has 5 minutes left, so let's give him the 5 minutes to finish up so we can get to some results, and then we can come back and
all right, so I think we all got a general sense of what identification is. It's just comparing girls in the same district further away, or girls in earlier years, or boys in the same village or in the same hospital. Okay? And I'll just go quickly through the results in my 5 minutes, and I'll just focus on the bottom line. Okay? So we're estimating discrete time hazard models. So for the hazard that in any given year, a girl gets married. So we're starting with marriage and childbearing results. Okay? And what you find is that any given year, access to factories, proximity to factories, results in a 28% drop in the hazard of marriage. Right? So girls who are exposed to garment factories are 28% less likely than girls who are not exposed to garment factories in any given year to be married. Okay? When you look at childbirth, you get pretty much the same type of relative effect. Girls who are exposed to factories are 29% less likely to be married in any given year compared to girls who are not exposed. Okay? And when you look at boys, where of course, they're not directly giving birth, but whether they become a father, there's no significant effect either on marriage or childbirth. There are smaller effects, because of course there's some general tumor effects that's coming from the marriage. Okay, and then we looked at kind of the age profile of this. So now doing, it's kind of like a quadruple interaction with the fourth interaction with age, right? And here's what it looks like with marriage. So this is 0, right? And so this lower hazard of getting married is actually coming from this tail. So with garment factory exposure, girls are less likely to be married at ages 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. Okay? And this is a 95% confidence. And it turns out that it's not, if we also tested this, it's not that they are any more likely to remain unmarried forever. Right? So by the age of 25, 26, they actually catch up more than catch up. Right? But they're just basically shifting marriage from this age group to further up here. Okay? So when you then try to do a quadruple interaction with first, which is a really rare outcome, you don't really get much. There's no pattern here, there's no linear pattern, but also it's not significant in any particular age group. Okay, now on enrollment, and this is what Asim was talking about. So this is the 0 line here. So what you're seeing is, so when garment factories arrive, the parents react by keeping their 5 to 10-year-old girls in school more. Okay? So over here is where you get a significant effect. So 5 to 10 age group, the young girls, so parents notice when factories have arrived, and if those jobs will persist, then it makes sense for young girls to stay in school now. Now, it's not statistically significant. Oh, it starts getting significant here, but for 18-year-olds, right, it actually becomes negative, which is what you had predicted, which is that when a factory job arrives, 18-year-olds are actually more likely to drop out. And that's exactly the age profile for when people are jobs. And then I should also say that when we're thinking about the mechanisms underlying the delay in marriage and childbirth. It could be this education effect that is pointed out, but it could also be directly that people are working, right? And you do see that if the factories arrive at the right age group, so when you're between 10 and 29, that's when you're at highest risk of getting married. Actually, it's 10 and 23. That's when women report that they're much more likely to have worked outside the home. Okay, and then for the female stipend program, we actually do what you suggest, Asim, which is comparing older sisters to younger sisters, whether or not, because it was a program for 6th grade onward, whether or not they were in 6th grade at a time when the program arrived. Right? And so you do a different triple interaction because it was a female school stipend program, so compared to boys, compared to older daughters, and then post 1994. And you actually end up getting very small effects. You don't get much in the way of affecting educational decisions. Now, this is, of course, this is in contrast to programs like Progresa in Mexico or Bolsa Escola in Brazil, where they have much larger effects of conditional cash transfer programs for keeping girls in school. But there, the amounts given are actually orders of magnitude larger. Right? It's nothing like 25 to 60 times the amount that we had in Bangladesh. Okay. So all the data suggests that factory expansion was a more likely cause of growth, enrollment gains, and this marriage and fertility postponement. And extrapolating, we were able to say that about 15% of the national gain in growth enrollment can be attributed to government sector growth. But this is a back of the envelope calculation with a lot of assumptions about what's happening in the rest of the country. And so I'll just conclude by saying that it appears, at least in Bangladesh, that education policy is strongly tied to trade or industrial policy. These two things are not independent at all. So there's a huge demand-side driver of educational investment decisions. Enrollment strongly responds to the arrival of jobs, and it seems to also improve welfare for young women as they avoid early marriage and childbirth. So why does it matter? It's because of, this is not to minimize what's been going on in Bangladesh. Right? So the Rana Plaza factory disaster that captured the world's attention recently. But this is not the only disaster that's happened. Prior to that, there were smaller scale disasters that still cost, added up, cost hundreds of lives. And this is a huge failure of governance. It's a huge failure of our humanity. So these are very, very risky jobs, right? But the point is that so far the evidence has been dominated by these anecdotes regarding, the bad working conditions in sweatshops that end up killing people, right? But if you were to, and as a result, there's been calls for boycotts, and in fact, there's been some progress made in that. So large buyers in the U.S., like Disney, the U.S. government, they made moves to restrict or boycott imports from Bangladesh, right? But if these boycotts or restrictions are designed to protect the workers, they might end up hurting a much larger number of the workers that they are designed to protect. And so it's really important, especially given what's going on in Bangladesh, to rigorously evaluate the full range of welfare effects and thinking about the trade-off between these risks, what can we do about that, against how it has changed the lives of women in Bangladesh over the last 30 years. Okay? And in fact, just one anecdote I'll share is I was staying in a hotel with a lawyer from Lian Fung, this huge, we were both staying in the hotel, and we had breakfast every day. And it was really interesting to talk to him. So he worked for this large trading house based in Hong Kong, and he was sent to Bangladesh to live for 4 months. So he's just trying to work with this Alliance for Bangladesh Worker Safety to try and clean things up and really try to do something about it. And he clearly stated to me that, okay, for now it's okay and we're working on it, but if there's even one more disaster that gets the kind of press coverage that Rana Plaza got, Bangladesh is done. Okay, so this is also, while we're talking about long-run women's welfare effects, right, this is also another thing that's really important for policymakers to think about. Right? If we have another disaster, it's, possibly we're done, people move to Vietnam or Indonesia, and until a disaster strikes there.
I don't think so, because I think Bangladesh is also now initiating the Better Works program by ILO, and that would sort of ensure that the buyers stay there.
Yeah, except that. Except there's also construction issues. There's, lots of governance issues. How these buildings were constructed. Like this disaster, right? And it's hard to kind of go back and fix those. That's what they're trying to do, right? But the point is that if something like this happens again, it's very risky. Okay. Hopefully you're right. Nothing like this will happen again.
Hi, my name is Chris Watman. I'm a professor at Columbia, and I'm going to talk briefly. It's always hard to talk about a good paper. It's more interesting to talk about a good paper. This is going to be more of a discussion, I think, than a critique. And I'm going to try to bring in some of the larger issues. Okay, so I was just sort of thinking in my head, just how do I think about some of the effects of industrialization on welfare, which is in some sense what this paper is getting at. And you can sort of attack the problem in a number of ways. So I drew this really simple set of circles. So we think a lot of the direct effect on those who get the job. So this, and it's not just the factory disasters and people who lose their lives. The hundreds of people who lose their lives in an industry of 3 million is a concern. It's not my first concern personally. I'm thinking about what is the effect on the health and education and lifetime incomes of the 3 million who survive such disasters. And on the one hand, we think there might be a wage premium. We might think these are good jobs. We might think that people have a rising wage profile over time when they get these jobs. This is a hypothesis. All right, but at the same time, in a lot of these countries, these people, these women in particular, have very poor outside opportunities. And sometimes when you start a job, especially if you migrate, there are speed bumps at the least to exiting, and there might be actual barriers. And in history, there's been an awful lot of coercion, right? So we need to be worried that firms are and firms can be very clever about this. And so we also need to be worried about worker exploitation, right? So in some sense, it's ambiguous. Likewise, there's a sort of larger, this next circle of people who aren't directly involved in the jobs, but are in the community surrounding those jobs and maybe can work in the future. This is where Mushfiq is focused, right? He's ignoring that middle circle. He's saying, I'm going to be able to give an answer. I have an identification strategy to let you know about this slightly larger circle. And I'm going to show you a bunch of outcomes that in Bangladesh look quite promising, that this is actually part of a big increase in the welfare of women. And then there's a larger circle still, which you can't get at with these village-to-village comparisons, which is what are the more generalized effects on welfare of industrialization. Okay, and so I'm going to try to touch on all three circles. I'm going to focus, obviously, on the one that Mushfiq talks about. I've just been reading this book. I'm going to talk a little bit at the end about Ethiopia, which is where I've been working, and I've been actually tackling this middle circle with an experiment in Ethiopia. And I've just been reading this terrific book, actually one of the best books I've read this year, by a former Wall Street Journal reporter, Leslie Cheng, called Factory Girls, and it's on women working in factories in China, and I absolutely hands down recommend you read this book if this topic interests you. And you see some interesting, it started me thinking about how can we generalize what we learn in Bangladesh. And of course, it's very hard. We have so few studies. So we have like my study, so in my head, I have my study, I have Mushfiq's study, and I have this book that I have read on China. So granted, that's more data than we usually, but most of the time I generalize on a lot less. But how do I start to think about this? So in China, this seems to be like really a largely migrant phenomenon, okay? And so the migrant women are going to face much different risks and opportunities, okay? And so I think, the women living at home and commuting to a short distance to a factory, we might actually expect this to look a lot rosier for their women, their siblings, than maybe women who are traveling hundreds of kilometers from home and being separated from their families. At the same time, the thing that's similar is that there's lots and lots and lots of factories, and people can move laterally or move upwards by jumping to firms. Okay, and this might actually increase the bargaining power and the options available to women. Ethiopia is different in another sense. Ethiopia looks a lot like the story that Mushfiq was talking about Bangladesh, where I'd say, I don't know if the majority, but a lot of the factory workers come locally. This idea of large-scale migration and living in dorms, this is generally not very common. And living at home gives them some positive outside options. What's different about both these cases from Bangladesh, I actually can't say this for sure about China, I suspect it about China, I'm fairly confident about Ethiopia, at least the pool of women in villages that are being drawn on, is that the marriage age is considerably higher than in Bangladesh. So, the idea of 13-year-old women getting married is relatively uncommon, at least in the more industrialized areas. Basic schooling is very, very common. So for a girl to have 4 or 6 years of primary education is, at least in the center of the country, is very common. And girls commonly work outside the home. Okay, so one of the things I wonder is how much of this effect that you see is due to, is the condition of these Bangladeshi women extreme in the sense that they have very little education, very few opportunities outside the home, and this is the first opportunity. So if we imagined a different world where women in Bangladesh had those basic options in the beginning, would we have seen this generalized effect? And I don't know. So it might be specific to this context. And I'd just like to hear more about that paper. Mild concerns, I'm not going to dwell on this because I don't have any major quibbles. You show the pre-existing trends. This is the key to any kind of difference in different strategies, the pre-existing trends. I was puzzled you didn't seem to control for those differential trends by village in the regressions, which didn't make sense to me. And I would have liked to see trends. You have so much, it sounds like you have enough demographic data. I don't know if you can construct retrospective household rosters, but if you can get a sense of pre-trends in migration, pre-trends in women's education and men's education and work, just by looking at the over 30s who aren't really eligible for these factory jobs. This would, I think, improve. I worry a little bit that these garment villages are less than 2 kilometers from the capital, and the other ones are less than 7 kilometers. You don't really grapple with this. You kind of wave your hands and say this isn't really a worry. I think you're really going to have to work more to convince us. But I was actually almost shocked that the pre-trends were so similar, given that these seemed like strikingly different differences from like economic powerhouses. So that was almost surprising to me. In part, this is taken care of, by your identification strategy, I think. But it got me thinking about what else is proximity to Dhaka. What else are they exposed to? You said you're focused on exposure to factories, but what else are they exposed to? What else is happening at the same time these factories are developing, right? And that may be hard to answer. But what other businesses are growing? I thought about supply networks, right? All the things that happen around these factories that start to supply these factories. There's a lot going on. So what are some of the things that would strengthen our confidence? So more discussion of this. I think just engage with this. I have to say, I feel like you might actually be able to tell us more concretely what's happening systematically in these factory versus non-factory places if we had more places in the data set. This is the least helpful comment in the world, I know, because who wants to go back and collect more data? At the same time, it may be a more data-rich environment than at least a lot of the places I work, such that you might actually be able to show us where are factories choosing to locate, and to show us maybe within different radii of Dhaka what's going on. And then, as I mentioned, control directly for these village trends. Then the other thing is, this is not a complete picture of welfare. It's not a complete picture of welfare, partly because we don't deal with this outer circle, but even within this inner circle, there are some good and bad things that you didn't discuss. If you have these demographic household things, the good thing you could look at is what about, are there fewer missing women in these villages? Are girl babies more likely to survive infancy? I think that would be huge if you could show that. But I was trying to think, what are the bads that can come with this exposure to industrial life? And one of the things that's very seldom spoken about, and probably people wouldn't talk to you about, so you might I'm not sure how you would get a sense of this, is working outside the home for the first time, especially away from home, in an environment that's dominated by men. I could well imagine that the increase in risk of sexual violence, at least I'm sure the risk of sexual violence from men within the kin circle is extremely high. And going outside that, I'm guessing it's extremely high. And I could easily imagine it grows immensely, and I could easily imagine the net amount of sexual violence these women are exposed to shrinks because they actually have more power. So that's really, I think this is really important to think about, especially when you hear statistics like 1/3 of women being sexually abused in some of these countries in their lifetime, right? So these are huge, huge numbers. It's also, to me, unclear. You sort of treat education and delayed marriage as unambiguous goods, and I think they are goods, but I wonder, like, who's gaining from this women's education, right? If women have very little bargaining power, granted, they're probably improving their bargaining power a little bit, but if women have very little bargaining power, then when you make them more productive, the same people that were reaping the gains before are just going to reap the gains from this more productive piece of machinery they have, which is this child. And so I believe that they're probably better off on the margin, but I think it's easy to overstate how important this is for women.
But we care about men too.
We care about men too. That's right. I mean, but I think we'd like to, I think we'd want to temper, we might want to note at least that we might actually be, exacerbating this inequality. I don't have much time. The other thing I wanted to mention, I'll go through this very quickly, is I did think that I wondered how much of this is, when you have boys, let's say like I have sons that are 6 years educated and girls that are 0 years educated, and you increase the income of the household, will I just mechanically spend more, especially if the income is going to the woman, or an older sister? Do I just mechanically spend more? Is this sort of is the income elasticity of education for women higher? This is just another mechanism to add to several mechanisms that I think we can't really distinguish. But that struck me as quite possible. Okay, what's not picked up with this strategy, I think, is also worth at least a note. Industrialization in some sense can be, certainly when you look at history, when you look at early industrialization in a lot of the West, you see sort of, and early industrialization in a lot of developing countries, you see sort of the de-skilling and the deindustrialization of all sorts of traditional activities, right? And this systematically lowers the outside options of most of the populace, and the import of all sorts of cheap goods, in some sense, puts a lot of people out of work. And so in some sense, this lowers their reservation wage, and it makes it possible for factories to hire people much more cheaply. On the other hand, this increases their real incomes because they can buy more things, so again, it's ambiguous. I actually think the scale tips towards industrialization being largely beneficial, but you might want to just put a nod to this thing that in terms of when people think about the welfare, especially when you sort of frame this around the welfare effects of this, there's a whole bunch of stuff that you can't capture in the village to village. Just sort of a footnote, maybe less than a footnote, more than a footnote, less than a paragraph. But one thing that's important is, I think, this rising perception of returns to girls, you sort of mentioned, but it's actually probably going to lead you to understate your treatment effect, because women in these control villages, so to speak, are going to share this perception as well, especially if this migrant possibility is so large. I didn't realize from reading your paper how common migration is, as Chris raised. So this is probably going to, maybe on net, understate your treatment effects. Okay, the last thing I want to sort of point to is, I'll just sort of end on talking about what does this inner circle look like, and to the extent that Ethiopia and Bangladesh look similar, maybe this contains a little, I'm not going to call it good news, and I'm not going to call it bad news. And what we do is we have actually a randomized control trial of women to several Ethiopian industry factories, including a garment and textile factory, a shoemaker, a couple of other factories. So this is, you need to open a new factory line. This is a garment factory in northern Ethiopia. Ethiopia could be the next Bangladesh in terms of the explosion of textile firms. And you advertise 50 jobs, and 150 people, mainly women, will show up for those jobs. Actually, several hundred will show up, and maybe only 150 have the qualifications. And so what we persuaded the factories to do is to, amongst those minimally qualified women, hold a lottery for the jobs. And so you receive the jobs, and if you lost the lottery, so let's say 50 gets the job, 100 do not, 50 receive, there's another lottery, and 50 receive cash transfer and business skills training. So I'm like the union of these two presentations. Okay, and here's a picture of the factory. So this is actually, they're kind of, people don't enjoy this work. It's very regimented, and people don't like sitting for 8 or 9 hours a day sewing, but there aren't a lot of other jobs in this northern town, and so, but this is, you can see this isn't a terrible place to work, but nor is it an especially pleasant place to work. And very briefly, what do we find after following up these groups after 1 year? Well, the striking thing is that we don't see any evidence of this wage premium. So firms seem to be paying exactly these women's outside options, or a little bit less, such that about 80% have quit within a year. So 10% don't, if you're offered the job, 10% don't show up the first day. Something like 30 or 40% have quit within a month. And 80% have quit by the end of the year. And not just they've quit that job, they've quit the entire sector. They don't even go back to other industrial-style firms. All right? And they dislike the work, they find it too difficult for the very low pay. The firms, in some sense, lose because they've got all this churn in employees, but they win because the 20% who stay, they've somehow selected the people who have potentially the lowest outside options and or maybe a particular affinity for this kind of regimented, rather boring work. And so they have this mechanism for selecting the people who have the poorest outside options, and they pay them just enough to stay. What we don't see, at least in the short term, are large adverse health impacts or educational impacts like you and David Atkins see, but we see hints of them. So we see very small reductions in the likelihood of re-enrolling in school, maybe 1 or 2 percentage points. You can see that adding up if we were to follow long term, which we will. We see hints of some injuries, and we see workers telling us about all of the fumes and the things that they're worried about, and we don't see this showing up systematically in poor health after a year, but we might see that show up after 5 or 10 years. Okay, so this is why I say it's neither a good news or a bad news story. It's a little bit of a cautionary tale because it says that the firms are in some sense might be very clever in the sense that they're just going to squeeze as much because they have all the market power, really, and the workers do not. At least as long as there's these unlimited supplies of labor. So maybe just to finish up, if I had to think, I think that what I think makes this I think this is just a really interesting research agenda, and we really have just 1 or 2 or 3 rigorous studies of this, and so in some sense generating a lot more evidence is going to allow me to do something more than sort of wave my hands at a Wall Street journalist's book and our 2 unpublished studies, which would be a delightful thing to do in 3 or 4 years. Thank you.
So we have a bit more time, about 15 more minutes for questions or discussion. So let's open up the floor, and I suspect Austin would like to talk first.
I was much nicer for the record than Chris. Just a question, setting aside kind of the identification questions and quite a lot of them. What's the kind of external validity if you said, I'm coming back to the NGO presence in Bangladesh. What I was curious, Chris and I were talking about Pakistan and Bangladesh. Granted, they're very different places, but in Pakistan, most factory workers are men, not women, right? And so there's a question, which is, was there a prerequisite necessary to get this sector to have the effect that it did? And that's a different question. That's saying, and I don't know how to get at this, but maybe there's a way to tease that out to say, the puzzle isn't necessarily that factory jobs were available and look, women took it. The puzzle is what allowed women in a conservative environment like this to take factory work the way they did. And if that's the case, are you somehow overestimating the factory effect? Sans the NGO movement, there would be a zero factory effect. And that's not taking away from your factory effect, but it's asking a question which is, as you attribute it sort of more broadly to what's going on in Bangladesh, can we ever detract from the fact that everything which, the minute you react to Bangladesh, the first thing you hear is 3 large NGOs, seriously dominant in the social sector, mostly focused on women. So I'm trying to see how I can ever intellectually sidestep from that, or should I? Or maybe you can exploit it.
So let me respond just quickly with my reading of the literature and what else relates to this. But then I should let Dr. Hussey, Dr. White Nolan respond, because they'll have much better ideas of what's happening in the country. So 2 things that came to me is, if you think about like just the results that Chris just presented versus the results from Bangladesh, right? It suggests that like if you just randomly, it sounds like you randomly offered jobs to a set of people who weren't working, right?
People who applied and expressed interest.
Okay. So then that extensive margin of like bringing new people in who are not otherwise, I was thinking that maybe there's nothing there, that there's the selection of workers in the factory actually matters a lot for this to have the type of effect that we see in Bangladesh. Right? But then the other,
although Rob Jensen,
exactly, the other stream of literature suggests like in India, right? So all he did, that's the most remarkable thing I've seen in development, and it's not just Rob Jensen in India, it's Dominican Republic, it's Mozambique, right? Or Madagascar. And you see that you just go and tell people, oh, here's returns to education that's higher than what you
I meant if you did like call center stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So, and then the call center stuff was just going and telling parents, right, not even offering a job or something. But look, if you go to
call center gets actual jobs. You go to a village and you actually
they're not even jobs.
No, his experiment recruited and actually would help them actually.
No, he went in. He sent the recruiters, right, and the effects were on 5-year-olds. 6-year-olds.
But that's your mechanism. That's exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that suggests that just telling people, so maybe India is socially a little bit closer to Bangladesh than Pakistan is. Perhaps that's what it is. But that's just telling parents something, and maybe 10 years later, their girl may or may not learn English and get access to the job, so they start trying.
But you could actually interact. I mean, I don't know what your sample power is. You could, or whether there's variation in kind of social presence.
Actually, we did at some point. I might be misremembering, but I thought that my recollection is the measures of
NGO presence.
not NGO. Sorry, not NGO presence, but how religious or how conservative the family is. So you actually see more of an effect on the conservative side of the sample, right? Which is bizarre. But then I was thinking, well, maybe what's going on here is that that's the group of people for whom there was a decision to be made.
Can I? Bangladesh's achievement in sending girls to school, not only in primary school but also in secondary school, given controlling for this type of income, is remarkable. I mean, it has changed from being a laggard to a performer, and it's much more of a larger phenomenon than can be explained by 3 million jobs created. So your results is perfectly okay, but just like when World Bank was saying that their transfer policy was doing everything, your results should not also play.
No, my claim is 50%. That's my number.
Yes, this tremendous achievement, which is again, I mean, it's not just girls' schooling. Everything and the social indicators had a synergy. Reduction in fertility rate, having a demographic transition which is premature in terms of income levels, child mortality rate reduction, and in a sense the Bayesian assumption of shifting from quantity of children to quality of children. And this is a much more larger phenomenon than can be explained by one particular thing. But I'll just add another thing, which is recently a paper in Asia by Mark Rosenbeck and Mark Pitt about a very interesting thing about Bangladesh is that within households, the boys are still, girls are still discriminated against boys in terms of distribution of food, which means in nutritional terms boys are favored. But in terms of schooling, in fact, gender disparity is reversed. I mean, more girls go to school than boys. Has it something to do with the nature of the brown-based nature of employment for boys and some skill-based employment for girls? These are things which could be related to
So I just thought the first thing which was really striking compared to the increase in age of marriage with the drop in fertility over a very long time. So I think of those two ratios as somewhat corresponding to the long-run elasticity. So given that the fertility cycle runs to 45, I mean those changes on the time of marriage shouldn't have that much of an impact on total fertility if that were the only marginal relevant. So it clearly seems that the long-run elasticities are very large to that change in entry point. In your study, you measure those short-run elasticities, and they're pretty much close to one as you'd expect. But I'm thinking there's a divergence between the long run and the short run because perhaps Asia entry into these margins changes your beliefs about what's going to be possible for you in the future. It'd be nice to try to collect some information about what women expect to happen once they've been exposed to these jobs. And it comes back down to a sort of a...
Expect in terms of number of kids?
Number of kids or timing of kids. I mean, it's not just the fact that they've got less time to have kids that's driving this. I mean, we see that in the breakdown figure. And so it comes back down to what Chris was suggesting, that perhaps just opening up opportunities that I never thought about, that I never thought I was going to see in my lifetime, does have a big impact on how you think about the world. And that's why the effects may be very different, say in Ethiopia, where people had the opportunity to have these jobs. There were people who were willing to take these jobs. It's just that they were constricted by supply, but it's not as if we never knew about these jobs beforehand. So I'm just wondering whether one way to reconcile these two studies was even the work that Stephen's talking about, sort of opening up people's minds about what's possible in the future, does have a big impact on their preferences, and that's one way to think about these massive long-run elasticities they've got fertility as another benefit that we always want to factor in.
Yeah, so I'll just quickly respond to that. I completely agree that the way I presented it may have come up as, okay, here's some fertility, marriage effects, right? And then we're going to look at education and factory work as potential sort of intermediate mechanisms. But in Imran's point, that's absolutely valid. Those might not be the most important intermediate mechanisms, just because, if preferences for children hadn't changed, then they would just be having kids at 24. Right? That's absolutely right. So I did not, but I should not have claimed that those are the only mechanisms.
Well, I just wanted to add a little to the context to try and understand the results better. This is a huge question, and I don't think there is one answer to this. There are lots of little answers. First of all, I think if you look at the social context of Bengal, I'm not talking about Bengal as it was before the partition of India. Culturally, Bengal, gentrification in Bengal always had to do something with educating your family, and that included educating women. Of course, I haven't done the research. I don't know research in this area, so I cannot tell. But it appears that there were differences before partition between the education among Muslim girls and girls from other religions. They were better in terms of educating women in particular. But after Bangladesh, 1971 and the war in 71, I think had a tremendous effect on the psyche of the population. The war saw large-scale participation of women in the field, throughout the country, and I think that had something to do, which was very important in changing the mindset of women. These are very difficult to capture. So, but I'm simply trying to add a bit to the context, in which all of this is happening. And then you add to that the ideas on which Bangladesh was founded, which led to some good policy decisions early on. Secularism, democracy. The two together, I think, led to this early emphasis on the social services. And access to these social services meant that the government, if you look at the first line of Bangladesh, there is a pretty strong commitment there to education and health, although not much was done about these things from the beginning. But there was among the policymakers a very keen interest in promoting female education. And I think that the transfers that we talk about, the stipends, etc., the claims may be exaggerated, but the stipends actually came before the sort of exponential growth of the garments industry, which happened in the late 80s. And then the early policy decision on family planning actually resulted in delaying marriage, which also meant women became more involved. It may be a demand side, supply side factor, but I think this is an important factor. So all of these things, I think, need to be recognized in telling the story about women, the progress that women make in education.
So that's a great comment to finish things up on, because I think really the last three comments all have a nice unifying theme, which is that there are a number of context-specific factors that may have really intermediated the effect of what happened in Bangladesh. And I think that points a bit to what we're trying to angle towards within the research agenda of the IGC, which is that we know that, for example, with the themes that Imran introduced, we know that industrialization, both the movement of people from agriculture into industrial jobs and increasing labor productivity, is potentially a really key element in growth and poverty alleviation. And I think that we have, as Chris pointed out, some very small spots of evidence, but being able to link those bits of evidence together is key in understanding how these other factors, whether or not it was effective policy setting or the role of NGOs or aspirations along the way there, may be key to us, our ability to take what we've learned in Bangladesh and actually create some generalizable evidence that can help inform policy in Ethiopia or elsewhere within the IGC countries. And so I think that what we like to do is actually consider this kind of a bit of the start of a conversation. We're kind of working now on putting together the details of trying to get together an agenda-setting meeting for the entrepreneurship group, which will cover really the key, sort of a day probably here in London, but potentially locally, to cover the key themes that Imran put together. And so kind of keep this on your radar screen for sort of early in 2015, trying to get this group together and actually talk about where we can actually push the research agenda forward to actually generate some more evidence that can help inform policy. And with that, I'd just like to say thank you to everybody for their participation and their comments, and hope to see you all again quite soon. Imran's side comments meeting is actually very similar to World War II. Thank you.
I saw that.
Yeah, it's on VTA. Just go to something else and switch back to it. Visualizer or something.